The year was 2019. The world was still spinning in the pre-pandemic haze of normalcy. In the quaint, tree-lined suburbs of Denver, Colorado, life seemed picture-perfect for Lydia and Mark Sanderson. Their two-story home sat on the corner of Maplewood Lane, a postcard-worthy house with its white picket fence, neatly trimmed hedges, and a swing set in the backyard that saw more action from their golden retriever, Max, than their two kids, Noah and Ellie. Lydia was the kind of woman you'd see in a glossy home magazine, effortlessly beautiful, with soft caramel waves that framed her face and a smile that could melt ice. She was sharp, too, a lawyer by trade, though she had taken a step back from her career to focus on the kids and home. Her days were filled with PDA meetings, yoga classes, and managing a growing lifestyle blog that gave her a sense of fulfillment outside the walls of her home. Mark, on the other hand, was her grounding force. A tall, ruggedly handsome civil engineer, he spent his days overseeing major infrastructure projects around the city. His work required long hours and frequent travel, leaving Lydia to manage much of the household on her own. Mark wasn't the flashy type. He was dependable, calm, and deeply devoted to his family, or so everyone thought. At first glance, their marriage seemed enviable, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams. But behind closed doors, cracks had started to appear. Subtle at first, like a glass left unwashed in the sink, or a kiss that lingered a little less than before. Lydia felt it in her gut, a quiet distance growing between them, like two ships drifting apart in a vast ocean. And then there was Jake. Jake Harrison was Mark's best friend from college, a stockbroker with a reputation for charm and ambition. He had that magnetic personality that made everyone want to be around him, including Lydia. Jake had been a fixture in their lives for years, attending family barbecues and holidays. But in the last 6 months, his visits had become more frequent. At first, it seemed innocent enough. Jake was going through a rough patch with his girlfriend, and Mark, ever the loyal friend, offered his home as a sanctuary. But Lydia couldn't help but notice the way Jake's eyes lingered on her a little too long during dinner, or how his jokes were always directed at her, making her laugh in a way she hadn't laughed in months. It was harmless, she told herself. After all, he was Mark's best friend. What harm could come from a little attention? The story begins on a warm Friday evening. The kids were at a sleepover, and Mark was working late, as usual. Lydia stood in the kitchen, scrolling through Pinterest recipes for the blog when her phone buzzed. It was Jake. "Mind if I stop by? I'm in the neighborhood." The message read. Lydia hesitated. It wasn't unusual for Jake to drop by unannounced, but tonight felt different. She glanced at the clock. 8:30 p.m. She could almost hear her inner voice telling her to say no. But before she knew it, her fingers were typing, "Sure, come over." Jake arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a bottle of red wine. "Thought we could unwind a bit," he said with that signature grin. Lydia smiled nervously, taking the bottle and motioning for him to sit. She poured them each a glass, the rich aroma of the wine filling the room as they settled into the living room. They talked about everything and nothing. Jake's struggles at work, Lydia's blog, and how much she missed practicing law. But as the wine flowed, so did their honesty. "You know, Mark's lucky," Jake said, swirling his glass. "He has you." Lydia laughed, brushing off the compliment. "Come on, Jake. You're just saying that." "No, I mean it." He leaned in slightly, his tone softening. "You're amazing. Any guy would be lucky to have you." Her heart skipped a beat. It was the kind of compliment she hadn't heard from Mark in years. She felt a flush creeping up her neck, a mix of flattery and guilt. She knew she should change the subject, but instead, she found herself saying, "Thanks, Jake. That means a lot." The conversation took a lighter turn, and soon they were laughing like old friends. But beneath the surface, an unspoken tension lingered. Jake left around midnight, leaving Lydia with an empty wine bottle, a racing heart, and a mind full of questions she didn't want to answer. The following week, Lydia couldn't shake the encounter. Jake's words echoed in her mind, making her question everything about her marriage. Why hadn't Mark noticed her new haircut last week? When was the last time he told her she was beautiful? She hated herself for even entertaining these thoughts, but they were there, gnawing at her like a splinter. And then, another message came. This time, it was mid-afternoon on a Tuesday. "Can we talk?" Jake had texted. She stared at her phone for what felt like an eternity before replying. "About what?" "Last Friday," he wrote back. "I felt something. Didn't you?" Lydia's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she should shut it down, but instead, her fingers betrayed her. "I don't know, Jake. Maybe. Can we meet? Just to talk?" Lydia glanced at the clock. Mark wouldn't be home for hours and the kids were at school. She knew this was dangerous, so dangerous, but the thought of seeing Jake again, of feeling that spark, was too tempting to resist. Later that afternoon, they met at a coffee shop on the other side of town. Lydia wore a casual sweater and jeans, hoping to keep things low-key. But when she saw Jake waiting for her, his smile warm and inviting, she felt a jolt of excitement. They sat in a corner booth, the hum of espresso machines masking their conversation. "I didn't mean to make things weird," Jake began, his eyes searching hers. I've always admired you, Lydia. And last Friday, I realized just how much." "Jake, we can't," Lydia said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You're Mark's best friend." "I know," he said, leaning in closer. "But don't you feel it too? This connection?" She looked away, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She knew this was wrong, that it could destroy everything she had built with Mark. But a part of her, the part that craved validation and excitement, wanted to see where this could go. And that's where we'll pause for now. The stakes are rising, and the choices Lydia makes next could change everything. Stay tuned for the next chapter as we dive deeper into this tangled web of love, loyalty, and betrayal. And hey, if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. The coffee shop meeting with Jake lingered in Lydia's mind for days. She replayed their conversation, the way he looked at her, the electricity in the air. Guilt gnawed at her, but so did something else. A dangerous mix of curiosity and longing. She told herself it was harmless. After all, nothing had really happened. Not yet. But then came the texts. At first, they were innocent enough. Jake would ask how her day was going or send a funny meme. Lydia responded cautiously, trying to keep things light. But as the days turned into weeks, the messages grew more personal. "I can't stop thinking about you," Jake wrote one evening. Lydia stared at her phone, her pulse quickening. She should have ignored it, deleted the message, blocked his number. But instead, she typed back, "I've been thinking about you too." And just like that, the floodgates opened. Mark, oblivious to the growing tension between his wife and best friend, was busier than ever. His latest project, a major freeway expansion, had him working late nights and early mornings. When he was home, he was exhausted, collapsing onto the couch or into bed without much more than a quick kiss goodnight. Lydia told herself this was part of the problem. She loved Mark. Of course she did. But their relationship had become so routine. Their conversations revolved around schedules, bills, and the kids. There was no spark anymore, no passion. And Jake? Jake made her feel alive. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Lydia found herself scrolling through her phone, reading and rereading her messages with Jake. He had a way of making her laugh, of making her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. Before she knew it, she was typing, "Wanna meet?" His response was immediate. "Name the time and place." They met the next day at a park on the edge of town. Lydia wore a casual sundress, hoping to look effortless. Jake was already there when she arrived, leaning casually against a picnic table. His smile widened when he saw her, and she felt that familiar flutter in her chest. "You look amazing," he said, his voice warm. "Thanks," Lydia replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "So do you." They walked along the park's winding trails, talking about everything and nothing. Jake told her about a trip he'd taken to Italy years ago, describing the cobblestone streets and vibrant sunsets. Lydia found herself hanging on his every word, drawn to the way he made even the simplest stories come alive. As they rounded a corner, the trail opened up to a secluded clearing. Jake stopped, turning to face her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Lydia," he began, his voice low, "I know this is complicated, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. Something real." Her heart raced as he stepped closer. She should have stopped him, should have walked away. But instead, she let him cup her face in his hands and press his lips to hers. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened, igniting a fire she hadn't felt in years. When they finally pulled apart, Lydia's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt, excitement, fear. They all swirled together in a chaotic dance. But as Jake smiled at her, his eyes filled with genuine affection, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Back at home, Lydia tried to push the encounter out of her mind. She threw herself into her routine, playing with the kids, cooking dinner, and pretending everything was normal. But when Mark walked through the door that evening, she couldn't meet his eyes. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, noticing her uncharacteristic quietness. "Yeah, just tired," she lied, forcing a smile. "Long day with the kids." Mark nodded, accepting her answer without question. He kissed her forehead and went to shower, leaving Lydia alone with her thoughts. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She knew it could destroy her marriage, her family, everything she had worked so hard to build. But the pull of her feelings for Jake was too strong to ignore. She told herself she could handle it, that she could keep it from spiraling out of control. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. As the weeks went on, Lydia and Jake's relationship grew more intense. They stole moments whenever they could. A quick coffee here, a stolen kiss there. Each encounter only deepened the connection between them, making it harder for Lydia to resist. But keeping their secret wasn't easy. There were close calls, like the time Mark almost saw one of Jake's texts pop up on her phone. Lydia had to laugh it off, claiming it was just a group chat with friends. And then there was the night Jake accidentally liked one of her old Instagram photos, raising eyebrows from some of their mutual acquaintances. Lydia quickly untagged him and brushed it off as a mistake, but her nerves were starting to fray. The breaking point came one rainy Saturday afternoon. Mark was supposed to be working on site, but the weather had delayed construction, bringing him home early. Lydia, unaware of his change in plans, had invited Jake over under the pretense of helping her with a project for her blog. Mark walked through the door just as Jake was leaving. The sight of his best friend standing in the foyer, looking far too comfortable, set off alarm bells in his mind. "Jake? What are you doing here?" Mark asked, his tone friendly but edged with suspicion. "Oh, hey man," Jake said, forcing a laugh. Lydia needed some help with her camera. "You know I'm the tech guy." Mark's eyes flicked to Lydia, who was frozen in place, her heart pounding. She managed a weak smile, but she could tell he wasn't convinced. "Right," Mark said slowly. "Well, thanks for helping. I've got it from here." Jake nodded, clapping Mark on the shoulder before making a hasty exit. As soon as the door closed, Mark turned to Lydia. "Why didn't you tell me Jake was coming over?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't think it was a big deal," Lydia replied, avoiding his gaze. "He was just helping me with some blog stuff." Mark studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing. "Lydia, is there something going on I should know about?" Her stomach dropped. She knew she had to tread carefully. "No, of course not," she said quickly. "Why would you even think that?" Mark hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. Forget it." But as he walked away, Lydia could tell he wasn't convinced. The cracks in her carefully constructed facade were starting to show, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the charade. And that's where we'll leave it for now. Things are heating up, and Lydia's double life is on the verge of unraveling. What do you think will happen next? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next chapter of this unfolding drama. Stay tuned. The days following Jake's abrupt encounter with Mark were a whirlwind of tension and paranoia for Lydia. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was starting to suspect something, even if he didn't have concrete proof. His questions became more pointed, his glances more searching. Meanwhile, Jake was growing restless, frustrated by their stolen moments and the secrecy of their relationship. "Why don't we just tell him?" Jake asked one evening as they sat in his car, parked in an empty lot. The rain pelted the windshield, mirroring the storm brewing between them. "Are you insane?" Lydia shot back, her voice sharp. "Mark is your best friend. He trusts you. This would destroy him." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm tired of sneaking around, Lydia. I want more than this. Don't you?" Lydia's chest tightened. She did want more, but the cost was too high. "I can't," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't lose my family." Jake reached for her hand, his grip firm. "You're not happy, Lydia. You deserve to be happy." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Lydia pulled her hand away, staring out at the rain. "I have to go," she said, her voice barely audible. Back at home, Lydia found Mark sitting in the living room, his laptop open on the coffee table. He looked up as she walked in, his expression unreadable. "Hey," he said, his tone casual. "Where were you?" Lydia froze, her mind racing for an excuse. "Just out for a drive," she said quickly. "Needed some air." Mark nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or suspicion. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, just a lot on my mind," Lydia replied, forcing a smile. "I'm going to bed." As she walked away, she felt his gaze linger on her, and a chill ran down her spine. She knew she was running out of time. The next morning, Lydia woke to the sound of Mark on the phone. His voice was low, but there was an edge to it that made her stomach churn. She slipped out of bed and crept to the top of the stairs, straining to hear. "I just want to make sure," Mark was saying. "She's been acting different lately." There was a pause, and Lydia's heart pounded in her chest. Who was he talking to? What was he asking? "Yeah, I get it. Thanks, man," Mark said finally. "I owe you one." As he hung up, Lydia quickly retreated to the bedroom, her mind racing. Had he called a private investigator? A mutual friend? She didn't know, but one thing was clear: Mark was digging. Jake, too, was beginning to unravel. The secrecy, the lies, the constant waiting. It was all taking a toll on him. He started sending Lydia more messages, each one more desperate than the last. "I can't do this anymore," one read. "Either we're together or we're not." Another, "You have to make a choice, Lydia. I'm not going to be your secret forever." Lydia's anxiety grew with each message. She wanted to tell Jake to back off, to give her space, but she was afraid of pushing him away entirely. She was balancing on a knife's edge, and the slightest misstep could send everything crashing down. The breaking point came one evening when Mark arrived home earlier than expected. Lydia was in the kitchen, her phone on the counter as she prepared dinner. She didn't hear him come in, didn't see him pick up her phone, and read the message from Jake that had just come through. "I miss you. When can I see you again?" "Who's Jake?" Mark's voice was cold, cutting through the air like a knife. Lydia froze, her blood turning to ice. Slowly, she turned to face him, her mind scrambling for a lie, an excuse, anything. He's a friend," she stammered. "From my book club." Mark's jaw tightened, and he held up the phone. "A friend who sends you messages like this?" Lydia's heart raced as she searched for a way out. "It's not what it looks like, Mark. I swear." "Then what is it?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been lying to me." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes as the weight of her lies came crashing down. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." Mark's face hardened, and he took a step back. "How long, Lydia? How long have you been sneaking around behind my back?" I don't know," she admitted, her voice shaking. "A few months." Mark stared at her, his expression a mix of anger and pain. "With Jake?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lydia nodded, unable to meet his eyes. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. I was lonely. Lonely? Mark's voice cracked, and he ran a hand through his hair. I've been working my ass off to provide for this family, and you're lonely? I'm sorry, Lydia repeated, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. Mark shook his head, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I trusted you, Lydia. I trusted him. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Lydia standing there, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to run after him, to beg for his forgiveness, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. She had broken something between them, something that might never be repaired. The fallout was immediate. Mark packed a bag and left that night, refusing to tell Lydia where he was going. The house felt empty without him, and Lydia was left alone with her thoughts and her guilt. Jake tried to reach out, but Lydia ignored his calls and messages. She needed time to think, to figure out what she wanted, but the silence was deafening. Her life was unraveling, and she didn't know how to put it back together. And that's where we'll pause for now. Lydia's world is in shambles, and the stakes have never been higher. What do you think will happen next? Will Mark forgive her? Will she choose Jake? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next chapter of this gripping tale. Stay tuned. Mark didn't return home that night or the next. His silence was deafening, and it left Lydia in a state of constant anxiety. She called his phone repeatedly, but every call went straight to voicemail. She sent texts, pleading for a response, but there was nothing. It felt as though the ground beneath her had disappeared, leaving her suspended in an abyss of uncertainty. The tension finally broke 2 days later when Lydia received a text from Mark. We need to talk. I'll come by the house tonight. Her hands trembled as she read the message, a mix of relief and dread coursing through her veins. At least he was willing to talk. But what would he say? What would he do? That evening, Lydia sat in the living room, waiting. The sound of Mark's car pulling into the driveway sent her heart racing. She smoothed her hair, trying to appear calm, but the knot in her stomach betrayed her nerves. When Mark walked in, his face was unreadable. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his eyes scanning the room before finally settling on her. He looked tired, older somehow, and the sight filled Lydia with a pang of guilt. Mark, she began, rising to her feet. I'm so glad you're here. Sit down, he said, his tone cold and authoritative. She obeyed, sinking back into the couch as he took a seat across from her. There was a long, heavy silence before Mark spoke. I need to know everything, he said. Every detail, every lie. Don't sugarcoat it. I deserve the truth. Lydia swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. Mark, all of it, he interrupted. Start at the beginning. And so she did. With tears streaming down her face, Lydia confessed to everything. The chance meeting with Jake, the flirtation that spiraled into an affair, the lies she told to cover her tracks. She told him about the stolen moments, the guilt that gnawed at her, and the growing realization that she had made a terrible mistake. Mark listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finally finished, the room was so quiet she could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. I don't even know who you are anymore, Mark said finally, his voice filled with quiet devastation. The woman I married would never do this. I'm still me, Lydia said, her voice breaking. I made a mistake, a horrible mistake, but I still love you, Mark. I've always loved you. Mark laughed bitterly. You have a funny way of showing it. The conversation quickly turned heated. Mark's anger, which he had held back during her confession, boiled over. He demanded to know why she had done it, what Jake had that he didn't. Lydia tried to explain, to articulate the loneliness and the need for validation that had driven her to cheat, but her words only seemed to fuel his rage. You were lonely? Mark spat. Do you have any idea how hard I've been working to keep this family afloat? To give you and the kids a good life? And this is how you repay me? I wasn't thinking clearly, Lydia said, her voice trembling. I was selfish, and I'm so sorry, Mark. Please, give me a chance to make this right. Mark shook his head, standing abruptly. I don't know if I can. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house was unbearably tense. Mark stayed in the guest room, avoiding Lydia as much as possible. They communicated only when necessary, their conversations clipped and formal. Lydia tried to give him space, but the distance between them was agonizing. Meanwhile, Jake was becoming increasingly desperate. He called and texted constantly, begging Lydia to meet him, but she ignored him. She knew she had to focus on her marriage, even if it meant cutting Jake out of her life completely. But Jake wasn't willing to let go so easily. One evening, Lydia was home alone when the doorbell rang. She opened the door to find Jake standing on the porch, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. "What are you doing here?" Lydia hissed, stepping outside and closing the door behind her. "Mark is home." "I don't care," Jake said. "You've been ignoring me, Lydia. We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," Lydia said, her voice firm. "It's over, Jake. It has to be." Jake's face twisted with hurt and anger. "You can't just cut me off like this. I gave up everything for you. I never asked you to do that," Lydia shot back. "This was a mistake, Jake. I can't do this anymore." Before Jake could respond, the front door opened, and Mark stepped outside. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Jake straightened, his jaw tightening. "I'm here to talk to Lydia." Mark's gaze shifted to Lydia, his expression a mix of betrayal and fury. "You're still seeing him?" "No," Lydia said quickly. "I didn't invite him here. I didn't even know he was coming." Mark turned back to Jake, his hands clenched into fists. "You need to leave. Now." Jake hesitated, his eyes flicking to Lydia. "Is that what you want?" "Yes," Lydia said firmly. "Please, Jake, just go." With a bitter look, Jake turned and walked away. Mark watched him until he was out of sight, then turned to Lydia. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "I can't live like this." "Mark, please," Lydia pleaded. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Just tell me what to do." Mark shook his head, stepping back inside and closing the door behind him. Lydia was left standing on the porch, her heart shattering into pieces. The following days were a blur of anguish and regret. Mark barely spoke to Lydia, and when he did, his words were laced with bitterness. He spent long hours away from home, and Lydia suspected he was meeting with a lawyer. The thought filled her with dread, but she didn't dare ask. Jake, meanwhile, continued to reach out, his messages becoming more erratic and emotional. Lydia blocked his number, desperate to put an end to the chaos, but the damage had already been done. And that's where we'll pause for now. The tension has reached its peak, and the fallout is imminent. What do you think Mark will do next? Will Lydia be able to salvage her marriage? Or has she lost everything? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for the next chapter of this gripping story. The days after Jake's unannounced visit were a nightmare for Lydia. She could barely look Mark in the eye without seeing the anger and betrayal simmering beneath the surface. Every moment felt like walking on eggshells, and the tension in the house was almost unbearable. Mark, for his part, became increasingly distant. He spent hours in the garage, working on his car, a classic Mustang he had been restoring for years. It was his escape, his sanctuary, and Lydia knew better than to disturb him. But the silence between them was deafening, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their marriage was slipping through her fingers. One evening, Lydia decided she couldn't take it anymore. She found Mark in the garage, his hands covered in grease as he worked under the hood of the Mustang. "Mark," she began hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look up. "What do you want, Lydia?" "I want to talk," she said, stepping closer. "We can't keep living like this. We need to figure out where we go from here." Mark straightened, wiping his hands on a rag before finally meeting her gaze. His expression was unreadable, but the weariness in his eyes was unmistakable. "Where we go from here?" he repeated, his tone bitter. "That's funny coming from you." Lydia flinched but pressed on. I know I've hurt you. I know I've broken your trust, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. Please, Mark, just tell me what to do. Mark let out a harsh laugh. You think this is something you can just fix? Like it's a broken lamp or a leaky faucet? Lydia, you didn't just hurt me. You destroyed us. His words cut deep, but Lydia refused to give up. I love you, Mark. I love our family. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but that doesn't mean we can't find a way back to each other. Mark shook his head, his jaw tightening. You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about the affair. It's about the lies, the betrayal, the fact that you put someone else ahead of me and the kids. How am I supposed to come back from that? The conversation quickly escalated, emotions running high on both sides. Lydia pleaded with Mark to give her another chance, but his anger and hurt were too raw, too overwhelming. Finally, he snapped. You want to know what I've been doing these past few days? He said, his voice rising. I've been meeting with a lawyer, Lydia. I've been trying to figure out how to protect myself and the kids when I decide to leave. The blood drained from Lydia's face. A lawyer? She repeated, her voice trembling. You're serious? Dead serious, Mark replied. I'm not saying I've made up my mind, but I need to be prepared. I won't let you drag me down any further. The words hung in the air like a guillotine, and Lydia felt her world crumble around her. She had known things were bad, but hearing Mark talk about leaving made the situation feel impossibly real. In the midst of their argument, the sound of the doorbell shattered the tension. Lydia and Mark exchanged a wary glance before Lydia went to answer it. Standing on the porch was Jake. What are you doing here? Lydia hissed, her heart pounding in her chest. I need to talk to you, Jake said, his voice urgent. I know I shouldn't be here, but I couldn't stay away. Before Lydia could respond, Mark appeared behind her. His eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of Jake standing there, and his hands clenched into fists. You've got some nerve showing up here, Mark said, his voice low and dangerous. Jake held up his hands in a placating gesture. I just want to talk to Lydia. Please, man. I don't want any trouble. You don't want trouble? Mark repeated, stepping closer. You think you can just waltz into my home, disrupt my family, and not face the consequences? The tension between the two men was palpable, and Lydia quickly stepped between them. Stop it. Both of you, she said, her voice shaking. Jake, you need to leave. Now. Jake hesitated, his eyes flicking between Lydia and Mark. Is that what you really want? He asked. Yes, Lydia said firmly. Please just go. Jake looked as though he wanted to argue but ultimately turned and walked away. Mark watched him go, his jaw tight with barely suppressed rage. The encounter with Jake was the breaking point for Mark. That night, he packed a bag and left, telling Lydia he needed space to think. The sight of him walking out the door, suitcase in hand, was like a punch to the gut, and Lydia couldn't stop the tears that streamed down her face. Days turned into weeks, and Mark didn't come home. He stayed with a friend, refusing to answer Lydia's calls or texts. The silence was unbearable, and Lydia felt as though she were drowning in her own guilt and regret. During this time, Lydia began to reevaluate her choices. She realized how much she had taken Mark for granted, how her own insecurities and selfishness had driven her to make decisions that jeopardized everything she held dear. She knew she couldn't undo the past, but she was determined to do whatever it took to prove to Mark that she was committed to rebuilding their marriage. She started by writing him a letter, a heartfelt apology in which she laid bare her soul, expressing her love for him and their family and her deep remorse for the pain she had caused. She poured her heart into the letter, hoping it would be enough to reach him. When she finished, she slipped the letter into an envelope and left it on Mark's car windshield, hoping against hope that he would read it. Meanwhile, Mark was grappling with his own emotions. He couldn't deny the depth of his pain, but he also couldn't ignore the love he still felt for Lydia. He found himself rereading the letter she had left him, her words stirring something deep within him. Could they find a way back to each other, or was it too late? Mark's inner turmoil reached its peak one evening when he visited the park where he and Lydia had shared their first date. As he sat on a bench, Memories of their laughter and joy flooded his mind, reminding him of the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. And that's where we'll pause for now. Mark is at a crossroads, and Lydia is fighting to save their marriage. Will they find their way back to each other? Or is this the end of their story? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for the next chapter of this gripping tale. Mark stood at the edge of the park, the crisp autumn air swirling leaves around his feet. He had come here for clarity, to sort through the chaos in his mind. Lydia's letter was tucked into his jacket pocket, the words weighing heavily on him. Her apology felt genuine, but could he trust it? Could he trust her? As he sat on the bench, memories of their early days together flooded his mind. He remembered their first date here, how Lydia had laughed so hard at his joke that she spilled her coffee. He remembered the way her eyes sparkled when she said yes to his proposal. Those memories were like ghosts, haunting him with what they had once been. But those memories were now tainted by images of her betrayal, of Jake standing on their porch, smug and unrepentant. Mark clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He couldn't let go of the anger, but he also couldn't shake the love he still felt for Lydia. Meanwhile, Lydia was pacing the living room, her nerves frayed. She had spent hours drafting that letter, pouring her heart into every word. But now the waiting was unbearable. She glanced at her phone for the 100th time, hoping for a text, a call, anything to show that Mark had read her words and was willing to talk. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Her heart leaped, hoping it was Mark, but her face fell when she opened it to see Jake standing there again. "Jake, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "I needed to see you," Jake said, stepping inside despite her protest. "I can't stop thinking about you, Lydia. I know you're going through a lot, but we had something special, and I'm not ready to let that go." Lydia groaned, running a hand through her hair. "Jake, this has to stop. I've already made my decision. I'm trying to fix things with my husband." Jake's expression darkened. "Fix things? After everything he said to you? Lydia, he doesn't deserve you." Before Lydia could respond, the front door opened, and Mark walked in. He froze at the sight of Jake standing in his living room. The tension in the air was palpable, like a storm about to break. "What the hell is he doing here?" Mark demanded, his voice cold and dangerous. Lydia stepped between them, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Mark, please let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," Mark snapped, his eyes never leaving Jake. "Get out of my house." Jake hesitated, glancing at Lydia as if waiting for her to intervene. When she said nothing, he finally turned and left, but not before muttering, "This isn't over." The door slammed shut, and Mark turned to Lydia, his eyes blazing with anger. "What the hell was that? Are you still seeing him?" "No," Lydia cried, her voice breaking. "I told him to leave. I don't want anything to do with him." Mark shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "How am I supposed to believe you, Lydia? You've lied to me before. How do I know you're not lying now?" Tears streamed down Lydia's face as she pleaded with him. "I know I've messed up, Mark. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I swear to you, I'm done with Jake. I want to fix this. I want us." Mark's anger began to waver, replaced by the exhaustion of carrying so much pain. He sat down on the couch, burying his face in his hands. "I don't know if I can do this, Lydia. I don't know if I can trust you again." Lydia knelt in front of him, her hands gently resting on his knees. "I know I've broken your trust, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But please, give me a chance to prove that I'm still the woman you fell in love with." Mark looked up, his eyes filled with anguish. "Then show me. Show me that you're willing to fight for us." In the days that followed, Lydia threw herself into rebuilding their marriage. She cut off all contact with Jake, even going so far as to block his number and social media accounts. She attended therapy sessions, both alone and with Mark, determined to confront the issues that had led to her betrayal. Mark, too, began to soften. While the pain of Lydia's actions still lingered, he couldn't deny the sincerity of her efforts. He saw the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who had once been his partner in everything, fighting to make things right. But just as they began to make progress, a new revelation threatened to derail everything. One evening, Mark received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "Do you really know the whole truth?" Attached were photos of Lydia and Jake, taken months ago, showing them in intimate moments, holding hands, sharing a kiss. The timestamp on the photos suggested that the affair had been going on much longer than Lydia had admitted. Mark felt his stomach drop as he stared at the images, his heart pounding in his chest. He had wanted to believe Lydia, to trust that she was telling the truth, but this felt like a betrayal all over again. When Lydia came home that night, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. Mark confronted her, showing her the photos and demanding an explanation. Lydia's face turned pale as she realized what he had seen. "Mark, I can explain. Don't you dare say that," Mark shouted, his voice trembling with rage. "You told me it was a mistake, that it only happened once. But this proves you've been lying to me all along." Lydia began to cry, her voice cracking as she tried to explain. "I was scared, Mark. I didn't want to lose you, so I didn't tell you everything. But I swear, it's over now. I'm committed to us." Mark's face hardened, and he shook his head. "I don't know if I can believe you anymore, Lydia. I don't know if there's anything left to save. And that's where we'll leave it for now." With trust shattered once again, Mark and Lydia are at a crossroads. Can they overcome this new obstacle, or is this truly the end of their marriage? Let us know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next chapter of this gripping story. Welcome back to Cheating Tales Lab, where our story comes to its emotional conclusion. If you've been following Mark and Lydia's tumultuous journey, you know things have been anything but easy. Can this couple overcome their challenges? Or is this the final chapter of their marriage? Stick around to find out, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales. Let's dive in. Mark stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound feel amplified. Lydia had left earlier that morning for another therapy session, her desperate attempts to rebuild trust a stark contrast to the tension still lingering between them. He hadn't slept much the night before. The anonymous email, the photos, they were seared into his memory. Yet, despite the undeniable evidence of her prolonged betrayal, he couldn't shake the image of Lydia's tear-streaked face as she begged for another chance. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she carried herself, the raw vulnerability she displayed. For the first time in months, he saw the woman he had married, stripped of pretense and excuses. When Lydia returned, she found Mark sitting at the dining table, the photos spread out in front of him like pieces of a puzzle he was trying to solve. Her heart sank, knowing this conversation was inevitable but dreading it all the same. "Mark," she began, her voice trembling, "I know I've lost your trust. I know I've made mistakes, terrible ones, but I'm here to take responsibility for all of it." He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Then tell me the whole truth, Lydia. No more half-truths, no more omissions. If there's anything left you haven't told me, now's your last chance." Lydia took a deep breath, her hands clutching the back of a chair for support. "The affair lasted 3 months. It wasn't just once, like I told you before. I was scared to admit it because I didn't want to hurt you more than I already had. But I see now that hiding the truth only made things worse." Mark's jaw tightened, and he let out a slow, measured breath. "Why him, Lydia? Why Jake?" Her voice broke as she replied, "Because I felt invisible, Mark. You've always been this incredible, strong, reliable man, and somewhere along the way I started to feel like I wasn't enough. Jake made me feel wanted, like I was still desirable. But it was a lie. He didn't care about me, not really. And I let that lie ruin us." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of her confession hung heavy in the air, but for the first time, there was no defensiveness, no excuses, only raw honesty. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Mark said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "But I see that you're trying, and that means something. If we're going to move forward, it has to be from a place of complete honesty." No more lies, Lydia. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I promise, Mark. No more lies. The weeks that followed were far from easy. Rebuilding their marriage felt like trying to piece together a shattered vase, each fragment sharp and unyielding. Therapy sessions forced them to confront painful truths about themselves and their relationship. Lydia learned to address the insecurities that had driven her actions, while Mark grappled with the anger and betrayal that threatened to consume him. Slowly, they began to find their footing. Lydia went out of her way to demonstrate her commitment to their marriage, from cutting ties with toxic influences to planning date nights that rekindled the spark they had lost. Mark, in turn, worked on letting go of his resentment, allowing himself to see Lydia not as the woman who had betrayed him, but as the woman who was fighting to make amends. One evening, they found themselves sitting on the couch, a bottle of wine between them and a photo album in their laps. They flipped through pictures of their early days together, beach vacations, holidays with family, the day they moved into their first home. Each photo told a story of love, joy, and partnership, reminding them of what they had built together. I want to get back to this, Lydia said softly, tracing a finger over a picture of them laughing at a barbecue. I want to be the woman you can trust again. Mark looked at her, his gaze steady. It's going to take time, Lydia, but I'm willing to try if you are. The turning point came when Lydia received another text from Jake, despite having blocked his number. It was a new number, and the message was as manipulative as ever. Instead of hiding it, Lydia immediately showed it to Mark. Jake reached out again, she said, handing him her phone. I want you to know because I promised to be honest with you. Mark stared at the message, a mix of anger and admiration in his eyes. Thank you for telling me, he said. It means a lot. They agreed to report Jake for harassment, a decision that solidified Lydia's commitment to cutting him out of her life for good. It was a small victory, but it marked a significant step in their journey toward healing. Months later, as they sat on their back porch watching the sunset, Mark reached for Lydia's hand. We've come a long way, he said, his voice filled with a quiet strength. We have, Lydia agreed, squeezing his hand. And I know we still have a long way to go, but I'm grateful for every step we've taken together. Mark turned to her, a hint of a smile on his lips. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm starting to see the woman I fell in love with again. Lydia's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were tears of hope. And I'm starting to see the man who made me believe in love. Their journey wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without setbacks. But together, they learned that love isn't about never making mistakes. It's about choosing to fight for each other, even when it feels impossible. Their scars became a testament to their resilience, a reminder that even the deepest wounds can heal with time, effort, and a little bit of faith. And that's a wrap on Mark and Lydia's story. What do you think? Was their love worth saving, or should Mark have walked away? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Cheating Tales Lab for more captivating stories of love, betrayal, and redemption. See you in the next one.